All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us for this webcast. Today's top HR priorities and practices heading into 2025, sponsored by WorkBuzz and Velocity Advisory Group. This webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI credit and one SHRM credit, so please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. You'll receive an email from hr.com within 24 hours that will include your certification information. That is for the live attendees. And then during the webcast, attendees, we invite you to and encourage you to engage in the chat. You can choose everyone from the drop down box. And then if you have questions for any of the presenters, we ask that you place those in the Q&A tab in your webinar controls. All right, all the logistics on my end. It is now my absolute pleasure to turn it over to you, Mark Vickers, to get us started.
Oh, thanks, Rhonda. Yeah, today's top HR priorities and practices heading into 2025. There's lots of great data here, and it's pretty much brand spanking new. So looking forward to getting into it. Before I do that, though, I want to talk about our co-presenters. Ryan is the People Science Officer at WorkBuzz, and for the last 12 years, Ryan's done his utmost to support business all over the world to put culture and employee experience first. We're going to be talking a lot about experience today. And he's safe in the knowledge that doing this is naturally going to deliver better business performance as well. And Amanda utilizes her skills to support Velocity and their efforts in identifying efficient solutions to intricate business problems, as well as supporting survey response-based data analysis. So let's start with you, Amanda. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, thanks for the welcome, Mark. I'm excited to co-present today alongside Ryan. A little bit about me. I consider myself to be a survey enthusiast. Never thought I would consider myself that in my career, but that's who I am. Been under many aliases, including Data Wizard. I typically run engagement surveys, employee experience surveys with organizations. I analyze the data in an objective way and then help co-create action plans on how to really take action on the results that we're seeing.
All right. Nice to have a bunch of survey geeks on this one with me today. Ryan, how about you?
Yeah, hi Mark. Really pleased to be here today. And yeah, like Amanda, love survey data. Spent the last 12 to 15 years, as you mentioned, doing lots of research into organizational culture, employee experience. I think businesses have done an okay job so far in terms of using that survey data to drive improvements to the colleague experience. But I think there's a lot more potential to use that insight more and to really use that type of employee feedback to drive change as organizations. So really looking forward to getting into that a little bit today to see how we can tackle some of the big themes for 2025.
All right, let's start getting into it. First things first, though, the survey size was 533 HR professionals. Again, it's pretty much brand new information. We had the surveys out from May to September, and a large majority of these folks are from the United States. So when you're looking at the data, think primarily United States. That's pretty much where it's coming from. First thing let's talk about is how are today's organizations listening and communicating with employees? And we asked the survey question about how often does your organization actually run employee surveys, speaking of surveys. And we found that a lot of folks actually failed to survey employees more than once a year. You know, over the last probably 15 years or so, we've seen more and more companies survey more frequently. It used to be like you do your annual climate survey, and for a big company, that was a big deal, and all the wheels would start spinning and the plates, and it was a huge deal. Now I feel like some organizations are still doing that, but a lot of organizations are doing them more frequently, as we can see in this data. And just really quickly, you're going to see a footnote here talking about the relationship between some people who do more surveys and less surveys in a year. And we do some correlations about that. We probably won't talk a lot about that. We're going to talk mostly about the risers and decliners, and I'll explain that in a minute. But you'll see some notes about that. And we also asked folks about how difficult it is to reach deskless or frontline workers in organizations. And as you can see, some folks, about 50%, say, it's pretty easy for our organization. But a lot of folks are in that neutral to very difficult thing. So it's clearly not necessarily easy to reach deskless or frontline workers these days. And Amanda or Ryan, either you want to get into the deskless or frontline worker thing?
You go, Amanda.
Yeah, reaching frontline workers can be incredibly difficult, as we know, but one of the top things that I see coming out of survey comments, especially from frontline workers, is that they want to see senior leaders. They want to see that presence. So when we think about how difficult it is to reach them, taking actions as much as possible, whether it's through SMS communication or even going on site to anybody, it really, really improves that employee experience. And that's taking action based on survey results.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'll just quickly add to that. I think when we think about surveys, historically, we've often designed them as very much as like an HR program of listening. So just thinking about the questions, the nature of what we're asking colleagues, sometimes for those individuals who are working, in those frontline roles, really thinking about what matters most to them and how do we ask questions that are really going to tap into their life and their day-to-day experience of work, make the surveys feel like they aren't just for an HR or a business perspective, and lens into how people are feeling, and actually make surveys more for the individual colleague as well. That helps drive their engagement and response rate with it too.
Right. Yeah, we see we do a lot of research, and we ask folks whether they're reaching out to their employees via their mobile devices. And a lot of companies don't even have technology to do that yet. A lot of organizations, which we feel like, wow, that's pretty old school at this point. Well, let's talk about the key takeaways for the data we just covered. Today's HR professionals are really well aware that communication is key. We see that in a lot of the HR.com research. Surveys are a tried and true HR tool, but what kinds are best and how often should they be sent? That's one of our topics for discussion, as Ryan was just talking about. And don't forget about communicating with your frontline workers, determine the best way to effectively communicate with them, and have ways to actually measure that. We're going to talk about some measurement things too. So, Amanda, why don't you go first here? Both in this study and the various others we've conducted, we found that communication seen as among the most critical skill sets for HR professionals, yet a lot of them don't feel that they're that great at communication skills. So how can HR professionals actually hone their communication skills to communicate better?
That's a great question, especially when we think about, there is that pressure on HR, but also the rest of the organization. So we have to kind of hold that same consistency in the way that we're holding expectations for how we're communicating with one another. I think that the basis is a level of empathy, more so communicating with someone the way that they want to be communicated to. And we think about the different behavioral styles or communication styles. Some people are really data oriented, like ourselves, and most of those people are in HR. And so they're giving all the facts in their email, all the data you can think of. And we call those owls at Velocity, owls like the bird. But eagles, on the other hand, are dominant and they would not appreciate that. They're typically who your leaders are. They want the bottom line, they want the bullet points, they want to know what the goals are. So, how do we flex to that style of communication, or how do we flex to the way that others want to be communicated to, and change the way that sometimes we are processing that communication as well?
Right. How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, it's such an important topic. I mean, communication is such a big driver of trust, trust in leadership, confidence in the future and optimism for the future of the businesses that we work in. So, given how important communication is in building that trust and that belief in the openness and honesty of our leaders, we need to get it right. And so, I would really recommend that we do more as organizations to really understand through measurement how our comms are doing. So breaking comms down into transparency, relevance, and frequency as the three core areas making up your comms, and really, drilling down and understanding what that looks like Amanda said, across different demographics and different workers that you have within the business, so you can really understand where the gaps are, where the strengths are, and what more we can do to communicate effectively with all colleagues. And just a quick kind of second point to it as well is, particularly in the survey, the feedback world, is making sure that we really connect the dots with what we learn from employee feedback, and how that does actually influence what we do with organizations. I think sometimes we do see not enough action happening off the back of surveys. But actually, where we do see actions coming off the back of employee surveys, we don't always do the best job of really connecting the dots, making sure that employees are really aware that these things that we're doing are specifically because of these themes and different feedback points we heard on surveys. So really over communicating off the back of surveys specifically from a communication perspective can be super impactful.
Okay, good. Let's get in the next part of this. We found that employee experience and engagement are the top priorities in this. And we did ask about a lot of different priorities. We found that most of the folks responding to this survey said employee engagement in their organization stayed about the same or actually gotten worse over the last year, but the rest say it's improved. Now, based on this data, you're going to hear us refer to the engagement risers and the engagement decliners. That's based on this particular outcome variable. So the folks who feel like they've had some improvements in engagement are the risers, the others are the decliners. And we just wanted to run some correlations during this study and kind of see how those things affected some of the other issues we were covering. And we asked folks, what are the top 3 HR priorities right now? We could see engagement and experience there are right at the top by quite a large margin. We have a number of other issues down there that are pretty much statistically tied for second place. You have performance and productivity and attracting talent. We're going to be talking about those quite a lot. And things like retention and employee well-being are also going to come up various times in this thing. So those are all pretty highly rated issues, but there's no substitute for engagement and experience based on our data here. This is something employers are thinking a lot about. One of our findings here, when we looked at the risers and decliners, where the risers are much more likely to select things like employee well-being as among their top 3 priorities. So, if you're looking at some correlations between engagement and some of these other areas, here's what we're seeing. We saw some attracting talent. They're also more likely to highlight that. And they're about twice as likely to include diversity, equity, belonging, and inclusion, or D&I. Lots of different names for this these days. But for some reason, they're very much more inclined to select that as among their top priorities, which we found pretty interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about diversity as we go. So some of the key takeaways here are, generally speaking, engagement experience is the highest HR priority today. Why is that? What does it really mean for you as HR professionals? That's something that you all need to be thinking about and that we're going to discuss today. As you're looking at your engagement data, look for correlations, like recruitment, diversity and inclusion. We found, what's the connection within your organization? How can you actually take advantage of those connections? Determine and agree on the HR priorities in your organization, and make sure you ask multiple stakeholders about what they view as HR priorities. So these are some of the things that we included in our paper that we're going to talk about. So obviously, engagement experience is super high priorities among HR professionals, but raising those level of engagement has long been a challenge for a lot of organizations. So what do you, Ryan, view as some of the best practices in this area?
Yeah, great question, Mark. I think I was I'm maybe not surprised to see the list of priorities, but in a way, looked at it and saw that engagement and experience being the top priority is almost the outcome that you're trying to deliver. And some of the things that were further down in the list are some of the really critical things that'll impact the culture in a positive way, that you'll have higher levels of engagement and a better colleague experience. So, for example, the amount of complexity that organizations are facing at the moment, almost constant change and transformation, how we manage change really effectively and lead our businesses through change is such a fundamentally critical thing in shaping culture and employee engagement. So for me, a big focus for organizations should be around that kind of leadership management role modeling that's happening right across our organizations, knowing that that's the single biggest lever we can pull to have a positive impact on employee engagement and experience. And therefore, specifically to your question, the quality of the conversations and the storytelling that we do at that senior leadership level to help them understand just how pivotal this is to the business, and getting them to really be accountable for it rather than look to HR to do it for the business is the real key first step for me, from my perspective.
Gotcha. How about you, Amanda?
Yeah, I think echoing Ryan, looking at that graph that you showed, where it does show the employee experience at the top, um, saying to improve that, I mean, the answers are right below. I would have chosen the same top 3 things, but at that bottom of the graph, it talked about learning and development opportunities. It talked about, like Ryan said, organizational change, um, anything around recognition. Those are things that really can boost employee experience. And it's the same as saying, oh, we want to reduce inflation. Well, there's so many factors that go into that. It's the exact same mindset here where it's really different depending on your organization. That's why having the data-driven decisions are important. And then that action is so relative to what your employees are saying. And so you want to reduce any inaction fatigue. You're not going to see employee experience boost. If you are taking communications, I think there was a question in the Q&A section about what else can you do beyond surveys. And the thing about surveys is you can then take action and say, well, because of your feedback on the survey, this is our plan of action. This is how it aligns with our strategic priorities. If we're talking about informal methods of getting feedback, whether it's through focus groups or manager one-on-ones, anything like that, it's harder to hold that accountability for the action that's taken, and that can reduce employee experience. So it's always one living organism. It's constantly going to ebb and flow, but we just have to think of the things that can positively influence it depending on our organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for responding to Michelle's question on that. And Ryan, I don't know if you saw the question, but it was basically, what can you do aside from, measuring survey through engagement? I'm sorry, surveys, in order to kind of get a feel for how it is at the organizational level. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I can see Michelle rephrased it to ask more about getting an organizational view without using engagement surveys. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting developments in the future around how AI is used more effectively to kind of measure engagement in a very different way across individuals, and then aggregating that data to paint an organizational view. I know there's lots of different conversations and experimentation happening around using different things like body language recognition within the workplace to get a sense of how colleagues are feeling. So it's going to be interesting to see where developments go in that space. But I think the other thing is looking at those other key indicators that we know that engagement drives, and research and the work that we do with organizations show that engagement drives, to see how those kind of people and performance measures across the organizations are looking, and use that to get cues about where you might have an engagement challenge. So I agree with Michelle's perspective that it doesn't always just need to come from surveys. And we should save the employee surveys actually for times when we really need specific insight from the organization to drive some of our strategies and some of the changes and some of the specific things that we're looking to do as businesses.
Yeah, those are all good. Some of the things that research shows for us is that more and more companies are using stay interviews as well as exit interviews. So through exit interviews, you're often going to learn about why somebody may be leaving the organization. Hopefully they're going to be candid in those. It kind of depends upon when you do that exit interview. But more companies are doing stay interviews as well. Like, why are you staying? Like, what is it in the organization? And if you do enough of those, that kind of gives you a feel for what might be going on within the larger organization. So those are a few other options. We do a whole paper on engagement and experience. So we did have quite a few other ideas in that paper. So if you want to look at that sometime, Michelle, you can also reach out to me, email me, and I'm happy to guide you to that. Okay, but for now, attracting talent has gotten a little easier, though challenges remain. We know that the sort of great resignation, so-called, in the United States, that's sort of over, but there's still a lot going on in terms of retaining and recruiting people. We asked folks, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to recruiting new people? And we found by a long shot that it's a shortage of qualified candidates with the right skills. So even though unemployment rates are still pretty low, at least in the United States, a lot of folks, it's still not always easy to find those folks with the right skills. People are staying in organizations better, but it's still more difficult. We asked, in your experience, recruiting and retention, recruiting and attracting talent at your organization is getting easier or getting much harder. And you can see just over half say recruiting and attracting talent has gotten somewhat easier. So it's one of these things where, yes, it has gotten easier because people aren't resigning from their positions as much, but there's still quite a few challenges here. When we look at this by the risers and the decliners in terms of engagement, we see this really, really strong correlation with engagement risers here. So engagement risers are a lot more likely to say it's getting easier, much easier. So we're seeing the strong correlation between engagement levels, recent rises in engagement levels, and the ability to attract talent, the feeling like that's getting considerably easier within organizations. So key takeaways here are today's recruiters are most likely to be concerned about a shortage of qualified candidates with the right skills. That's number one by a long shot. Despite lower resignation rates, few believe recruitment has gotten much easier. We had easier and much easier. The much easier it was a relatively low number. There's that strong correlation we were talking about. Some of our recommendations are use your workforce to help hone and communicate your organization's employer brand. We were just talking about communication. Leverage employee referral processes and programs. If you have an engaged workforce, they're more likely to give you good referrals, and you can often find great people through doing that. Take advantage of employee engagement through social media posts about open positions. That's another thing. If you're having really good engagement in your organization, then through social media posts, which your employees are likely to share, you're likely to get some good reactions through that too. So what do you view as some of the best ways of finding and recruiting skilled and qualified job candidates? And we'll go to you, Amanda, first.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I almost want to think about the question in the way, what are skilled and qualified candidates going to look for? How are they going to find you? Because are they going to be applying in the same way that others do, or will they be most likely leaning into their networks? And it's the same way for us, where our employees and our customers are our networks. And so your points here about building that engagement and boosting that's exactly how we pull in and leverage the people around us to pull in the skilled and qualified candidates in that way. Continuing to track KPIs such as your employee net promoter score. If people believe that you have an organization that's a great place to work, if they would recommend it for other people to work at, that's absolutely something to monitor, especially in times of change. But I think just ultimately improving that engagement and seeing what the network can do for you will bring in those candidates.
Excellent. What are your thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, I agree with Amanda. I think again, I would be tempted to, and have done a lot of work with organizations on again connecting things like their recruitment channel data with longitudinal employee engagement data and employee retention data to actually see whether certain specific recruitment channels are more almost successful for the organization in terms of helping them find the candidates that stay and thrive in the organization. And another way kind of to almost reverse engineer that is to really understand from different people doing specific roles within your organization what really attracted them to the role and what they love about the role, and really using that to create a much richer employee value proposition and story around what it really means to work within these specific roles within your organization, moving away from some of those generic things that we'll say about, we'll look after your well-being and we'll develop you and things like that, to actually really talk to different demographics around why should they really want to come and work for your organization specifically. Tell a much stronger story, and then that can really help recruit. And as I said, recruit in specific areas and using specific channels that really help your organization keep that talent in the business once they've joined.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, recommendations. All right, let's talk about performance. So we saw that, kind of attracting people has gotten a little bit easier probably in the last year or two. But performance is also a big thing. And we asked folks, in your experience, employee productivity and performance at your organization has, and you can see On the 36 and 7 level, those are the folks who feel like it's getting better. Only 7% say it's gotten much better. Then another 36% say it's getting better. So we actually have, fewer than half, about 43% feel like things are actually getting better. So this is an area where we're not quite having as much progress in a lot of different ways. But we also find another very strong correlation between the engagement risers and the engagement decliners here. So among the risers, they feel like 66% of them feel like they're getting more progress in terms of their productivity and employee performance, as opposed to only 16% for the decliners. So again, we're seeing this really strong connection between these different areas of engagement and productivity or performance. We also ask, what's the biggest challenge when it comes to productivity and performance here? And you can see by a wide margin, it's fostering collaboration across teams and departments. And we've all heard about these matrix organizations and all this kind of stuff where it's supposed to be easier to have good collaboration across different teams and departments, but obviously this is still an issue. Second on here is recruiting people with the right skills or upskilling. So again, that comes up, raises its head as a big issue. And third is low morale or motivation in the workforce. So again, getting back to that engagement. When we look at this by the risers and the decliners, we see that the risers are a lot less likely. The risers are a lot less likely to say that people across the organization are not empowered to make decisions. So for some reason, we're seeing a lot more empowerment among these engagement risers, basically. And then we can see low morale and motivation. You can see that the engagement decliners are more likely to say that. So basically, we're seeing this sort of inverse correlation across these challenges. So performance continues to be a major concern we're seeing through this data. It's important to leverage new techniques and technologies to boost performance and productivity, but that's really easy to say. It's much harder to actually get it done. So master fostering collaboration across teams and departments, improve upskilling capabilities, that comes up again. Assess employee empowerment, that comes up as an important issue. So do your employees feel empowered? And if they were more empowered, would they be more productive and engaged? These are some of the things to sort of investigate within your organization. So in the US, we've seen these growing concerns about performance and productivity as the economies move toward a more service as opposed to manufacturing jobs. What do you see as the best practices in terms of getting better performance from a greater number of employees, Ryan?
Or it's a challenge one. I also saw Kristen's question come up about hybrid working and how that maybe impacts some of the collaboration stuff as well. I think collaboration is such an interesting one because the vast majority of organizations will talk about it as a value or a key behavior in their framework, something that they want to be a big part of who they are. And we've seen lots of this conversation about hybrid versus fully office based versus fully remote working, and a lot of the fears around people working more remotely is the impact that it has on collaboration. But from my perspective, it's almost like we're forgetting just how much collaboration continued to show as a big issue and blocker to productivity pre-COVID. We weren't amazing as organizations at collaboration, cross-departmental team working before COVID. So all of a sudden, this conversation around whether hybrid or remote working is going to suddenly be a barrier to collaboration is quite an interesting one that's come up. For me, it comes down to what are the big behaviors that really drive good quality collaboration? And for me, it's diversity of thinking driven by psychological safety and everyone feeling like they can suggest ideas and feel listened to when they do suggest different ways of doing things. Going back to the basics of what really drives good quality conversations amongst different individuals and teams, a real focus on team dynamic and working with leaders of teams to make sure that they have the skills that are needed to really kind of manage and improve team dynamic and team performance. I personally don't think we do enough of that as organizations, and that then manifests itself in some of these data points that we're seeing.
Awesome. Amanda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think following on that topic of collaboration, it's a behavior that started at the top as well. And so when we have senior leaders who are communicating about how their teams did, it's not necessarily how their teams did and how they impacted another team. Or when we ask questions on surveys, it's a question like, I understand how my work aligns to my team's goals or the organization's goals and objectives, but it's not, I understand how my role impacts the departments I work with daily or the finance team or whatever that is, so even the way we're framing it isn't really embedded as a behavior. It's something we talk about, but it's not necessarily there. But productivity is such an interesting thing. I think that I'm going to do it. I'm going to say go to the data, data driven decisions here, because we think about engagement surveys, okay, I'm looking at it based on different demographics. If you pull in your performance data and you look at maybe employees who had exceed expectations on their performance reviews previously, and you pull that in and you see what's driving their engagement, you see what's driving their retention, their intent to stay, those items, you can really see what will impact that productivity for not only them but everybody else as well. And so I think that's a great place to look.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, let's talk about retention remaining a challenge. We've talked a little bit about this already, but we found that 37% of organizations say retaining employees is getting easier. Again, the Great Resignation is sort of over, but it's gotten easier to attract people, we've seen. But it doesn't look like it's gotten a lot easier to retain people within organizations, which is sort of an interesting finding. We ask in your organization, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to retaining existing employees? And the top answer, again, by a pretty wide margin, is offering a competitive salary and benefits package, so versus your industry competitors. But then there's also these other things like offering flexible work arrangements. We were just alluding to a moment ago. We will talk more about that. And getting employees to buy into and feel part of the company culture and journey. I do feel like culture is something we can talk more about. When we look at this by the risers and decliners, we feel that the risers are much more likely to feel like retaining employees has gotten easier. So again, in this particular data point, we're seeing a pretty strong correlation between engagement and the ability to retain employees. And I think that we would expect to see that, right? And the data is showing that. So some of our key takeaways here are that relatively few think that retention's getting easier. Folks are more likely to think that attracting people has gotten easier. Retention is strongly linked to engagement and experience, and we would hope that's true. Offering competitive salaries is still seen as a major factor influencing retention. We've gone through inflation, not just within the US, but within many different countries, and that's sort of made it difficult to handle a lot of the compensation issues. Hopefully that's dying down as inflation is dying down, but it's really seen as a difficult issue to handle within a lot of organizations. We've seen things like wage compression and some other issues we won't go into today, but it is a major factor on the minds of a lot of compensation and total rewards people. But culture and flexible work arrangements also play really strong roles here. So not only evaluate your total rewards plan, but your culture, your learning and development and career development capabilities, and your work arrangements. And after you've made those assessments, maybe make improvements about where they're needed and continue to evaluate employees' attitudes about them as you go. So what do you view as the keys to retaining great employees, Amanda?
I think every organization is going to be unique. That's why we do have to look at ourselves and identify what kind of culture we have. Can we keep a pulse on if any subcultures are appearing? That's something to focus on. But the best you can do is listen and take action. And so when you're doing these surveys and you're afraid of seeing pay and benefits at the lowest item, it usually is, unfortunately. And I'm sure it comes up in exit surveys. But when I've done regression analysis or correlation analysis for organizations this past year, I think there has not been a single organization where pay and benefits has been the #1 driver of engagement or retention. It is usually growth and development. It is based on inclusion in the workplace, so your culture that you have, well-being, some levels of work-life balance, but beyond that, I don't see it as the #1 driver. And so I think that's something to keep in mind is you really need to look at what is actually driving retention, what is actually driving the data that we're seeing, not just what's coming up a lot in the comments, what's making the most noise, because that's not always the case.
Okay. How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, agree with Amanda. I mean, benefits and you feeling like your pay is fair comparative to other people in the organization that are doing the exact same role as you, of course, are really, really important, but they're not long-term sustainable drivers of engagement. Of course, if you ask colleagues on surveys about rewards and benefits packages, they will always be the lowest or one of the bottom three scoring items on the survey. But again, as Amanda mentioned, when you do the regressions, they're never the main things that are driving lower levels of engagement or the things which come out as big predictors of retention. It is those things that Amanda mentioned, feeling listened to, feeling like you belong, feeling like you're appreciated for the work and the commitment and the motivation that you give to the organization, that you've got opportunities to grow and progression. We've talked about career development quite a bit, and I just wanted to emphasize a point here that it's really worth kind of thinking about this as organizations. How we make it really clear to colleagues about visible development opportunities beyond progression up a hierarchy inside the organization, and actually start to talk more about within role progression, how we can develop and stretch and challenge ourselves and grow as professionals within a role, and kind of break away from this traditional idea that progression is about a new job title and climbing up the ladder, for want of a better phrase.
Okay. Let me ask a question. Darian raised the question. He says, AI-driven HR tech tool for retention engagement is something Darian's working on. I'm wondering, what variables would HR workers and leaders prioritize in a predictive retention tool?
Well, the things we've just chatted about, if you've got longitudinal data, you can then build out a model that shows where these factors like feeling appreciated or perceptions of well-being, perceptions of development drop by X percentage points. It has X impact on levels of retention, but you need that longitudinal data, of course. But where we've built those out with clients, you can of course then show that where you're starting to see drops, that quickly alerts the organization that you might have a potential issue with employee turnover within this particular team or this particular department if you don't get on top of this and address it more quickly. So those predictive models are super valuable. It's just about making sure you've got the right data points connected up, and that you're looking at it early enough so that you can get ahead of the particular challenges that it flags.
Okay. How about you, Amanda? What do you think?
Oh, that's spot on. I think that definitely taking those historical components and in times of difficulty, in times of change, especially monitoring all those different factors that can attribute to the predictive model. I mean, that's how you're going to get that historical data that will allow you to base some of your predictions off of that. So I think, just as Ryan was saying, keeping that pulse, collecting as much as you can in any time when things are shifting to make that prediction.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk a little bit about D&I, which brings both challenges and opportunities according to the data we're looking at. We found that a majority say their organization's workforce has become more diverse and inclusive. And part of that is probably what organizations are trying to do, but probably part of that is also just demographics. Just the workforce, especially in the United States, is just getting a lot more diverse in terms of ethnicities, in terms of gender. We do see a correlation here with engagement, not as large a correlation as we see in some of these other areas we've looked at. So it is a major priority for engagement risers. So I think we should expect to see something around that, but perhaps not as strong a correlation as some of these other areas we've seen. Well, I asked folks, what's the single biggest challenge when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? We find that attracting diverse people to the organization is the top thing, cited by 26%. At 22%, we have people in leadership positions who aren't representative of a diverse and inclusive workforce. And at 21%, we have creating a working environment where all employees feel seen and heard. So some of the key takeaways here are attracting diverse people to the organization remains a really top diversity and inclusion challenge for organizations. But there are other issues like creating a culture where employees feel seen and heard. That's a big one. And striving over time to make senior leadership positions more representative of a diverse workforce. That's a challenge, perhaps something more companies should be looking to do. So you can also keep an eye on pay equity and transparency issues. We threw that one in there because we see that in some of our other research that these are becoming major issues, especially in terms of pay transparency, thanks to a lot of different changing laws within different U.S. states. So diversity and inclusion remain a real challenge for a lot of organizations. Sometimes the politicization of these issues make it even trickier to deal with in the U.S. Where do you think this issue is and associated approaches are going to be headed in the coming years? Let's start with you, Ryan.
The slide that you just had up, which had the biggest challenges to DEI, again, was really interesting because for me the top one is we're only going to address that challenge if we do the bottom three really effectively. Why does DEI matter to our organizations, and how do we really create an inclusive environment where people from any particular background can thrive? It's only then, when we've solved that particular challenge and created those environments, that diverse people would want to come and work for our organizations, but even more importantly, that we would be able to benefit from having that diverse talent coming into the organization, because you have to create the conditions for them to thrive. So I think there's still a long way to go to really get alignment across organizations as to why inclusion matters, and then a step on from that, really specifying why inclusion matters to our organization, and what benefits it's going to bring to the organization, and then how we're going to go about creating an organization that is truly inclusive and where diverse talent can thrive. So again, it's got to be a conversation that starts at the leadership level. And then secondly to that, with the representation at the leadership level, a big part of this is about equal opportunities, and as organizations, making it really clear what the potential pathway to leadership positions are, and making that fair and equitable for people of all different backgrounds. That's what people, colleagues, want to see in their organization. They don't suddenly expect the leadership team to just change overnight and be a completely different makeup the next day. But what they want to see is that the organization is doing the right things and laying the groundwork for people of all different backgrounds to have a leadership position in the future.
Right. Amanda, what's your take?
Everything Ryan said was spot on. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think commenting on the outlook, or recent trends, the politicization of it, I think in the last 6 months to a year, we've seen some of the efforts in D&I regress a little bit, which is unfortunate. But I do think for organizations, like Ryan's saying, if it's embedded in what you're doing, if it's a staple of your culture and how senior leadership is behaving, or the opportunities that you're presenting, or just showcasing that there are opportunities for an inclusive workplace and diversity, I think that you're going to stand out as a competitive organization. When other people are choosing to regress their efforts in that area, maybe because of recent political changes or anything like that, if it's a staple to what you do, then you'll maintain that and you'll continue pushing forward. Because what we see is younger generations, anybody millennial, Gen Z, they're still focusing on that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is still a primary topic for them. It's why they want to work at an organization. So to regress would kind of be a mistake for some people if that's the workforce they're trying to pull in. And while we might move in that direction, again, unfortunately, I think that doesn't mean that your organization needs to, especially if it's already embedded in what you do, or if it's something you continue to want to embed in what you do.
Right. And of course, the younger generations are just much more diverse in nature, in terms of, ethnicity, and even gender. More women are graduating from universities than men, more in more recent years, which is sort of changing some of the skills coming into the workforce. So a lot of these issues are all going together. Another thing we've seen in our research is that organizations aren't really looking at their so-called high potential pipeline within organizations. I don't know if you've both seen that or not, but it's interesting because if you're thinking about this in terms of succession management, you pretty much need to have a more diverse hypo pipeline in order to get people into those senior positions to begin with. So, don't wait until you're looking at your senior group to be thinking about this. Look at your high potential pipeline and some of the people you have in your succession program. I don't know if either you want to comment on that, but that's something we're seeing in the research.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you spot on, and you showed it on a slide far earlier on around succession planning not being a big priority for HR at the moment. But again, if we come back to thinking about leadership of the future, if we don't have as much of a focus on this as we potentially could, as you've identified, Mark, who do we end up putting into leadership positions in the future? Exactly the same kind of leaders that we've had in those positions for the last 20 years plus. So I couldn't agree more that we need to be thinking about it. But again, Amanda and I are always going to lean more into the data and the evidence side. How are you using data to really show and understand the behaviors that are being role modeled in different parts of your organization, and showing that where certain behaviors are role modeled, this is the profound impact that it has on performance, culture, engagement, and therefore use those behaviors to really drive, how you recruit, coach, develop, and promote people into those leadership positions in the future.
Okay. So Amanda, before you
Absolutely.
jump in, let me raise a question from Kristen was asking, and I thought maybe you could take a crack at that one. Is there any trend around whether risers are more or less doing hybrid workforce models? And just from the research, we do see a connection with the flexible work arrangements. I don't know that we specifically explored hybrid, but I would think that's an indication. But do you have any thoughts about that one?
I think there was recently a study about an organization that did A/B testing on, a team that was fully in office versus anybody who was a hybrid workforce. And they didn't see any changes in productivity, but they did see changes in well-being. So when you think about that productivity in terms of a hybrid work model, there was no significant difference. But when you talk about the well-being and creating that inclusive environment, that was a key actually priority and opportunity in the hybrid workforce, which was interesting because it shows that you maybe are prioritizing the work-life balance and the personal lives of your employees in some ways, but also highlighting on what Ryan said, it's that accountability of people leaders when you are, coaching for that high performance. It goes back to thinking about who is in that pipeline, but are your people leaders capable of having those conversations to coach somebody up in those roles and to coach them through that pipeline? It's all interconnected, as we can see.
All right, sounds good. I know Kristen has another question, but let's get into the multi-generational part, because I think this is actually part of diversity and inclusion in many ways. So we were asking about the multi-generational workforce. So for the first time in history, a lot of organizations are preparing for a workplace that could span 6 different generations. Sometimes folks think about this in terms of the term 6G. So we asked respondents, like, what do you think the biggest challenges will be in an increasingly multi-generational workplace? And we found that about half said that it's really communication to and across different generations, followed by workplace relationships between different generations, and ensuring that different learning styles are met across different generations. And you can see some of the other data, but these are the top 3 responses there. So once again, communication is arising as a real critical HR issue, and this time it's tied to generational differences. One thing we can recommend is evaluate the generational makeup of your workforce. This is something that you can probably get a pretty good handle on, but without stereotyping, put together things like communication, learning, culture management plans that incorporate your findings. That's easier said than done when it comes to this kind of thing. So basically, when we're looking at this, it's such a complex issue, but generally speaking, what do you view as some of the best practices related to properly managing a 6G workforce? Amanda, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that without stereotyping piece is really important here because people love to know about themselves. People like to take quizzes. They like to see, what a disc profile. What am I? Am I an owl or an eagle? That whole thing. Astrology. Am I an Aquarius, a Gemini? Some people like that. That's who we are. But with that, you don't want to jump to conclusions, and there's always going to be outliers. So thinking about ways that we can actually implement things into our organization that speak to everybody sounds really difficult. But if you do analyze your generational makeup in your engagement surveys, you're bound to see some differences, but not to a significant degree where you couldn't act upon it for everybody. Providing more growth and development opportunities, improving communication, improving work processes, that improves culture, that improves everything for everybody. So again, it's that piece without stereotyping, but thinking back also to a level of empathy, the active listening, respect for one another, those have to be the basis of what you're doing in order to have the different generations working together in a cohesive environment. If you don't have respect, a mutual respect, then it's going to be very difficult to improve anything else.
What are your thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, I think there's some super quick points on this one. Just building on the great stuff Amanda shared, which is, yeah, we do see some things within the data. For example, younger generation, your 16 to 24-year-olds in the workplace, they might be slightly more critical around things like sustainability and environmental issues, because they've been brought up in a world where there's more of a focus and a conversation on that, as well as some of the DEI B topics as well. So we shouldn't be surprised by some of that when we see it. Things around career development, coming back to the point I made earlier, that it's not that they want opportunities that their performance hasn't merited for perhaps, but it's more around just wanting that visibility and understanding of what is possible and what are the opportunities for them to grow and stretch, and what do they need to do to unlock some of that. So I think we can too quickly kind of stereotype, and there've been lots of those kind of common misconceptions or things that we hear about, the younger generation aren't as ambitious or as hardworking or as resilient as some of the older generations, and that actually we need to really, empathize, like Amanda said, understand them more, and understand just what value and great perspectives and fresh perspectives they can bring to the workplace. And then the final point on it is that we keep talking about generational differences, but sometimes we should flip that conversation and remember to talk about the similarities. What are the universal things that any human being wants in or outside of the workplace? Connection, sense of belonging, happiness. We're not really all that different when we get down and look at the nuts and bolts of what people really want. And so I think sometimes that can be a helpful perspective as well, rather than just talking about difference.
All right. Sounds good. Well, let's get to Kristen's question. Kristen asked, in the past year since DEI has become a politicized word, how are organizations accomplishing DEI progress without calling it DEI? Amanda, let's ask you about that one.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I mean, you can call it something different. I would definitely pulse in your organization. How would people define it? Put 10 different checkbox options of how you would define DE&I, and let people say how they align with it and what's that gap. And then call it something else, like people prioritization or equality at work or something like that, whatever you want to call it, and see if people redefine it to be closer to what DE&I actually is. It would be really interesting to see how people are perceiving it based on what you're calling it. I can't say that I've seen any trends of people who are changing it. Maybe Ryan or Mark, you have thoughts on that, but it would be really interesting to get that pulse of how people define it currently, and then just changing what that language is. Is it a little closer to what we're actually trying to accomplish with it?
You have any thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Like Amanda, it'd be good to see if we can find almost like some data to show, or case studies to show where organizations have made more progress by not kind of leaning into the terminology. It's almost like similar when organizations in the past have asked, how can we build psychological safety or improve our culture without tackling some quite toxic behaviors that might be happening at kind of senior levels or really influential levels. And often the answer is, well, you can't. You have to face some of those challenges head on. Culture change is about behavior change. So coming to the DEI point, you could try focusing in on the things that build an inclusive and equitable work environment. Really look at career pathways and progression opportunities, and performance assessment, and making sure that that's fair and equitable. Looking at your recruitment, and then some of the things that drive inclusion around psychological safety, feeling heard, some of those things that are happening behaviorally, you know, you could have more of a focus on them without necessarily calling it DE&I. But again, how much progress will you really be able to make as an HR practitioner and HR function unless you have some of those really key stakeholders and influential leaders across the organization really supporting you and advocating it as well?
Right. Yeah. I know that SHRM has now a different acronym. I don't want to say exactly what it is. I think it starts with inclusion now. So that might be one place you want to look, Kristen, for a different acronym if you're actually looking just to call it something else. And I think some other companies are doing this as well. They're sort of rejuggling some of the areas of it and kind of starting with things like inclusiveness and belonging and things like that. I don't think there's a tried and true answer to that, but I do believe SHRM actually tried to do that. So let's go to the next part of this. What does HR think about artificial intelligence? We ask, how do you feel about the increase in use of artificial intelligence to support future HR needs? And some of the responses were interesting, but the highest one was, I'm interested to see how AI can support me in achieving my goals and objectives, followed by, I'm on the fence. I think it can be useful, but I'm aware of its potential pitfalls. And I'm excited but concerned about losing the human element in human resources. So this is some of the responses there. And we've asked a lot of questions about AI and HR as well. And we definitely find a lot of folks are very excited about it, but there are some trepidations, there are concerns about, bias and some of those type of things, and some of those hallucinations and just all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, we're seeing there's cautious optimism about AI among HR professionals, both here and some of the other research we've done. But there are concerns, there's pitfalls about losing the human element. So a recommendation here is to put together a plan. Like you need to be keeping up to date with the latest AI news because this is changing, sometimes by the day in terms of what the different AI models are able to do. Speak to colleagues about their experiences, both good and bad, with AI and HR. Attend conferences and take courses on AI and HR. Create a list of best practices on how to use AI for HR. Speak with technology vendors who incorporate AI into their various tools. Develop and update guardrails and policies, and keep abreast of how AI is changing and is going to change the various jobs and work processes in your organization, because it's not just about HR, right? It's about your entire workforce is being influenced by these things. So it's moving so quickly, it's really difficult to keep track of. But what are some of your suggestions about how HR professionals can get the most out of AI, even while protecting their organizations from these drawbacks like bias, hallucinations, and these other issues? We'll start with you, Ryan.
Yeah, I would look at things like, as a practitioner, just think about like impact versus risk, and an effort as well, and find the things that are going to be relatively high impact but low risk. Uses of AI, for example, getting a bit of a start on writing a job description, for example, or some other ways that you might use it to kind of proofread, some kind of comms that you might be using. I would be wary of using it for people focused. A lot of people focus comms and just relying on AI. There's tons of research out there that shows that less than half of the global workforce have a lot of trust in people focused AI comms. And so again, it's just using the evidence and the research and that point that you've got at the in the list there around staying in touch with the latest best practice and keeping abreast of how things are changing. All that stuff's going to be really important. But again, it comes back to what we said at the beginning about communication. Know your audience, know your people, get a better understanding of how they feel about AI as well, and use that to influence the decisions you're making on how you use it.
Okay. How about you, Amanda? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Ryan's spot on. That cautious optimism is really important. We have to remember that when you think about AI, there's two different paths. There's the ChatGPT, Gemini path, and then there's more of the AI HR tools that you can utilize. So when we think of the chat more AI tools, it's more of a thought partner. It's not your thought leader. You are the leader, you are the expert in the conversation. I can't tell you how many times my husband, who's a physicist, I think half of his day job is just arguing with ChatGPT about how wrong it is. So hallucinations are real with that. But when we think about AI HR tools, a lot of the time you are uploading the information that's going into it. Think about tools that you can upload all of your onboarding resources, and then it's a chat and somebody just has to type in like, what are the benefits that I get? And it's pulling from the resources that you uploaded. There's much less, it's mitigating the opportunity for a bias or hallucination. So there's two different paths there. You're talking about ChatGPT or chat features for AI, and then you're talking about HR AI tools. And I think they're very different in the way that you approach it from the risk opportunity, like Ryan was saying.
Yes, we should echo that. Yeah, the HR tools are very different, but they also are evolving on a regular basis. So it's something to really be talking with your current vendors or potential vendors down the road. Hopefully they'll have more information about this, about how they're dealing with these issues like hallucinations, like you talked about, Amanda. So yeah, these are super important issues. Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour. So any last thoughts, Ryan, before we sign off?
Not really. I think it's a lot we've covered there, and I can imagine a lot of the audience will be thinking, right, where do we start with some of this stuff? But yeah, I think cautious optimism. That was a really nice way to summarize it from Amanda. It's not going anywhere. The AI piece. And we, at WorkBuzz, we're using it in a fantastic way to help, managers get a bit of an understanding as to how their teams are feeling, summarizing huge data sets far more easily, saving hundreds of hours of HR time. They're just great examples of how AI can be our friend in HR. But again, we talk about that fundamental need as humans to have that connection. So let's stick up for that and stand up for it and make sure that we continue to have really good face-to-face, human-to-human conversations too.
All right, sounds good. Amanda, any thoughts about any of the research we've covered today? Anything?
I think it's all incredible. I mean, today's top HR priorities and practices heading into 2025, we touched on a lot of topics. Each of these, within an hour, we could talk for hours about AI alone, for hours about communication alone. It's just a drop in the bucket of what we can actually do and accomplish and discuss. So as long as we're keeping those conversations going, that's how we're going to progress and make a difference.
All right, sounds good. Thank you both very much for being here. It's been a great conversation, and I wish we did have another couple hours, but sadly we got to go. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Rhonda.
Thank you, Mark. And also thank you, Amanda and Ryan, and to the folks at WorkBuzz and Velocity Advisory Group. Excellent presentation. And to all of you for joining us, we thank you so very much. You'll notice that there is a link in the chat to an exit survey. Your feedback is very important to us and everyone on the call. It helps us to offer more great presentations directed to the information that you are most interested in. Just take a moment to fill out that survey. It's going to pop open on your computer whenever I close out the session shortly. And then this has been recorded just now. So if you happen to have come late or you'd like to view it again, you can view it in the archives at hr.com. That will be ready within 24 hours. And in 24 hours within that time frame, we will also send you an email with your credit information as it does qualify for HRCI and SHRM credits, and those will be in your hr.com account. All right, again, thanks Amanda, Ryan, and Mark, and take great care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.